I'm here today with Tim of Obliviscaris to talk about the upcoming new record, Exul. If I pronounced it wrong, please correct me. Out March 24th on Season of Mist. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yeah, you got it.
All right, perfect. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm excited. It's just around the corner that the album is out, and it's been a long a long ride to get here. So it's an exciting time to finally be so close to the record being out and everyone hearing it.
So let me start off by asking you this. Was this a challenging record to make? And if so, what kind of growth as an artist do you take from those challenges?
Yeah, yes, it was a challenge in every way. We were writing this in 2019. And halfway through the writing process within the band, it was even challenging because we had so many ideas, and just trying to work out what fit together was a challenge because it was kind of we hit this point where we could take the record off in this direction or that direction, or like what do we do with so many ideas. And it was a good problem when you have like lots of ideas, but we're always really conscious on making sure that albums flow start to finish, and that that you're taking the listener on a journey within each individual song and the album as a cohesive whole. So finding that took a little bit of time, in a way that maybe was different to the other records. But I feel like that process and some of that struggle really helped the album because it forced us to really think about what we were trying to create as that cohesive whole, and not settle for something that was just good or a good song, to really challenge ourselves to make sure that it fit and that everything just made sense when you put it all together as a whole artistic package. And I guess from the other perspective, then, we were supposed to record the whole album in Australia together in March, April 2020. We were going to have, Dan record drums in Nashville in the US in March that year, which he did. And then our lead guitarist, Benji, who lives in France, our bassist, Martino, lives in Italy, and our producer, Mark Lewis, is in the US. And everyone was supposed to come to Australia in March 2020. Now, of course, everyone knows what ended up happening in March 2020. And so we recorded the drums. Dan got back to Australia, but no one else was able to make it. And so instead of recording the entire album March, April, and then it would have come out late 2020, we would have gone back on the road. And instead, the whole process got shut down, and it ended up taking us 2.5 years, and it was recorded in 9 different recording spaces in 4 different countries. So it was a bit of a nightmare, to be honest, to try to get it done. And there was definitely times where we worried that maybe it might not get done.
Now, during all of that time, there's a lot of time to go back and say, maybe we can do this a little bit different here. Maybe we can do this a little bit different there. So is the album that we have now, well, at least I have it now. So it's the album that I have now, the album that you guys started with, or is this like version 20?
Yeah, mostly the answer is yes. And we had this, it's one of those sliding door moments, right? Whereas the pandemic and the lockdowns happened the week after Dan recorded drums. Now, we had a bunch of songs half written that, if Dan hadn't have recorded drums, like the album's, whatever it is, like 52 minutes or something, if Dan hadn't have recorded drums in the US and the pandemic had have hit, we probably would have gone, okay, well, I guess maybe let's finish another song or two. And maybe the album would have been like 65, 70 minutes, just because we would have been sitting at home going, okay, I guess maybe we can finish those songs that we were working on, and put them on this record. Whereas we thought, okay, we'll set them aside. We'll come back to that. Maybe that's on the next album. But because we'd record drums, we were kind of locked into those songs because we couldn't, the borders were closed for a couple of years. There was no chance to go back to that studio and recreate that particular drum sound. And so we knew that these were the songs. So the drums, bass, guitars were all done. So none of that changed. I think there was maybe a couple of solos that hadn't been written by Benji at that time. But, almost everything was done for the guitars and the drums. in March 2020, because we were already had recorded the drums, and the guitars and bass were literally about to record in a week or two's time. The difference, of course, is when you get to the vocals and the violin parts, some bits, like a lot of it was done, but I would say, I don't know, maybe like 70-80% of those parts were done. But it was a bit more song specific. So for example, for Equas, that song was just pretty much totally done in every way. Maybe the lyrics weren't done yet. And so a few adjustments had happened to the vocals. But so that one didn't really change at all. But say for Growl, I hadn't finished my violin parts yet. I had a bunch of ideas, but I wasn't quite happy. And when the pandemic hit, I just shut everything down. And I didn't even look at the song for almost a year. So I came back to the song almost a year later, because I recorded my violin parts in April 2021. And so it was kind of like March 2021. I was like, ah, crap, I guess I better finish writing my parts for this song, after kind of putting it off for that whole period. Obviously the focus was on elsewhere. Other things kind of seemed a lot more important than finishing the record for a while. And so when you get to the ending of, say, Growl, and there's a lot of strings there, there's, big, violin solo at the end of that song. I wrote that a year after the rest of the record. And so that's an example somewhere where the opportunity to come back and revisit definitely changed the result. Like, because I don't know what I would have done a year earlier. Like, I'm sure it would have been good, but it wouldn't have been the same because I wasn't in the same space. I guess the other thing was that the closing track, Anhedonia, was written about that time as well, like March, April 2021. I wrote that when I was preparing to go into the studio a year later. And that was basically while I was working on that ending of Growl and feeling like that was something that could flow on from it as like a closing to the album. So I guess that was the only thing that was kind of added. But there was definitely a few vocal parts that would change, definitely some violin parts and things like that. But yeah, I know some other bands though that were in the position where they hadn't recorded and they did what you alluded to. They got to about 20th version of the record because they had so much time. So we were kind of stuck with the track list except for Anhedonia, but there was definitely a few adjustments we made along the way.
So going back to my first question, after all of this stuff, was this more tiresome for you, or is there learning lessons that you can take and growth that you can take from it?
Both. I mean, tiresome, I don't know if that's the right word, but it was incredibly difficult. But the challenge was really because of everything that was going on in our lives, in so many people's lives, and it wasn't like we had a unique story in that period, but the stress of what was happening in the world. And most of us are in Melbourne, Australia, which was the most lockdown city in the entire world. We had months and months and months of lockdowns, not being able to leave our houses, and recording studios closed. And several times we had studio time booked for me to finish my vocals, and then a lockdown happened in 2021 within 2 or 3 days before I was supposed to record, and it got canceled. And then the next time was 3 months later, and then that one got canceled. And then we had other personal things happening, like relationships breaking down, or deaths in our families, or all of the huge gamut of human experience was all happening whilst we were trying to finish the record. And the reality was that the end result was the record wasn't getting finished because all this other stuff was just a bit overwhelming, to be honest. And so it was really only when we got to the beginning of 2022 and finally it looked like the lockdowns were going to stop, after almost 2 years. And then it was me, I was the only one who wasn't finished yet. My stuff was being done last, my vocals, and there was still, about half the album of my vocals that wasn't done yet. And I found it really hard to get back in the headspace after so long and so much stop start. And to make sure you do these songs justice, and to make sure those initial ideas that I had would really come to fruition, because I was so passionate about these ideas, and it took me a while to get back into that headspace so that I could do that. And that was really the whole first half of 2022. It was me struggling to try to get back to start recording again, and me recording stuff and going, no, this isn't as good. This isn't as good as, it's good recording quality, but the performance isn't as good as a year and a half ago when I first wrote it. Because it's like trying to, like, sometimes you have this kind of magic when you first write an idea, and I'm like, the magic's not there. I got to find it again. And so that was the challenging thing. I guess what I was able to learn from all of that, as an artist, was, the importance of the process that you have to make sure that you can go through that, to make sure that you're picking up these things, that if something isn't good enough, if you're not connecting to it, to make sure you're noticing that so that you can work out what you need to do. And then I guess the other aspect was really, I mean, the thing I learned more than anything else was just how important all the other aspects of my life are in supporting my ability to be like a healthy and balanced creative artist, and that there's not really any benefit in pushing yourself to the degree of being that kind of, suffering artist type thing. That what is actually better for myself and all of those around me as well is that ability to really prioritize, my own health and well-being, and take that time for that self-care. And then when I do that, everything else flows a lot better. I'm not just able to connect better with those around me, but also to be able to dig really deeply into those songs in a way that is positive, and not draining.
So one thing that I find interesting is that the record, to me at least, it sounds very dark. And maybe sounding dark is not the right way of putting it. The atmosphere, the ambiance that comes from these songs, it feels like it's coming from a very dark place. But this was most of the record, you guys had an idea of what it was going to be before the pandemic even started. So where is some of that darkness coming from?
Yeah, so most of the record was written, I guess we started writing the record, the very beginnings of it, May 2019. But a lot of it was written the second half of 2019. And so, for me personally, I came back from our last European tour. I landed back in Australia on July 1, 2019, with the intention of, okay, that's the last tour for a while. Let's get on to writing the record. And I found out that my mom was dying of terminal cancer. And I totally fell apart. And it impacted everything for me because I was just a mess. And I was finding it difficult to just negotiate or to navigate everything in my life, just little things like, obviously it takes a lot of collaboration writing stuff. And that became more difficult. My role as a father, and, in a relationship, and these sort of things. And so for me, so Misericord 2, Equas, those two in particular, I wrote most of those songs in that period, in like July, August, September, like just after that news. And that was kind of one of the ways I kind of escaped from it. And so, the basis, like the chord progression from Misericord 2, we'd actually jammed that in May. And then I kind of sat down, I think it was about August. So it was kind of just after this kind of news came through. I remember I spent days at one time writing that entire song, like all of the strings, the violins, the violas, the vocals, everything. We kind of had just the chord progression, and then everything else. I just kind of locked myself in my room and wrote the whole thing, in quite a short period. And the same with Equas, where we had a bunch of ideas for some of that. And the first 4 minutes of that had been part of another song that we've been working on for a few months. And then around that same time, I think it was maybe about August, September 2019, you know, Matt and I got together and we kind of wrote the last 8 minutes of that in like one night. Like as far as the guitar riffs and the structure, and it was, you know, pretty much within 2 sessions. I reckon we wrote 2/3 of that in one night. We came back a few days later, finished the rest of it. And then I pretty much, once again, was like locked myself in my studio for another 3 or 4 days. And I wrote all of the strings and all of the vocals in that 1 week, and then said, you know, here you go, like to the guys. Like often it's not like that. Often it's like a really slow thing, and the strings and my parts are often done really late. Whereas that was, as soon as the riffs were there, it was straight on to everything else. And all of the strings and my vocals for both of those were done like really quickly and condensed periods, and both in that period. And so you know, I think then when the pandemic hit, you know, it was just it's just another thing, you know. Yeah. And so you know, I think that was, you know, when you think about hitting rock bottom and the amount you can learn from that, I mean, that was really my experience. Because, you know, for me as a person, I just wasn't doing very well. And then that was really bad for those around me, because, you know, when you don't look after yourself, like I wasn't in a position to be able to deal with that sort of upheaval to my life. And so the result was I became not as good a person to be around. And the ability to kind of look yourself in the face and go, okay, I need to make some changes so that I can start being, you know, a more like a positive and healthy person for everyone else to be around, is kind of almost interwoven with the journey of writing this record from my experience and the stuff that I contributed.
When I looked at this album, this record feels very condensed in terms of, it's one of those albums that's very demanding from the listener. Because I think if you sit down and listen to a song here and a song there, you're going to get the most out of each and every single track. But this record almost demands your attention, and it demands that you sit down and listen to it from the first to the last song in order for you to squeeze every single drop of juice that this album has for you. So in that feeling that I got listening to the album, what do you think it's most important to get that experience? The quality of the individual songs or the overall quality of the collective?
Yeah, well, I mean, the answer to get that experience that you're talking about, it has to be both. You know, I mean, I think that like I always talk about our first album, Portal of Eye, as like a collection of like 7 short stories, and they're not really related. Like a lot of them, they were written over about a 5-year period. It was kind of like a best of the early years of what we'd written. Whereas a lot of the other albums have been a little bit different because they've been written in a bit more condensed period. I mean, this one, obviously, the process of recording it got spread out, but a lot of the writing happened in a fairly condensed period. And I think that the key to creating that experience for the listener is that ebb and flow. And so, you know, a great example is, you know, you have like Egg Class, which is like 12.5-minute track, and then you follow it up with this 2-parter, almost 17 minutes, Misericord 1, 2, both which are totally different to each other, as far as, you know, Misericord 1 being lots of like quick changes and lots of different riffs and very high energy and almost this esoteric feel to some of the stylistic and genre changes, whereas you get to Misericord 2, and then that is this really, really slow burn. It's very, very chilled. You know, the guitar solo from Benji almost has this Pink Floyd-y type feel, but a bit more technical, you know, and then it has this huge epic buildup. And you need a lot of patience to appreciate that, because it's closer to a post-rock or Pink Floyd song as opposed to a technical metal song, which is more the first part. But that second part, when you compare that to Suspire, which is the next song, they're almost totally unrelated. And, you know, that's quite deliberate in regards to choosing which songs, because for us, we got to second half of 2019, we have a lot of songs we're working on, and it was, okay, we have these 3 or 4 songs that are half written or 2/3 written, And it was going, hey, we need to try to work out what's going to be the track list, which songs do we think will fit together. And so we were making decisions at that time with songs not even totally done. We're going, okay, I think this song would fit great here, so let's prioritize finishing that one, because we think that'll flow really well going out of that. And then you have this ebb and flow of the different stylistic things. The other thing that we have, which is, I think creates that ebb and flow with the stylistic elements within our albums, is that we don't just have one songwriter. We're not a band where one guy does the whole thing. We have multiple songwriters, and it's that ebb and flow between those different things. So like, just as an example, Misericord 1 was written more by Benji and Tino, like all the different guitarists and stuff like that. And then, I'm coming in, adding in, my stuff with the vocals and the violins and stuff. Whereas Misericord 2 was more something where I wrote a lot of that, and, a lot of the chord progressions and the guitars, as well as the strings. And you can tell, like, it has a very different vibe. And so we balance that throughout the record. Okay, we've had a lot of this style, let's go to this. And it's harder to get that array of sounds from one person. So the fact that we have multiple guys throwing up ideas, I think, gives us a lot of stuff to choose from, which within our own band, when we can have the patience to work through that process, which is hard sometimes, it can be really rewarding in regards to the result that you end up with.
When I look at the forest, it's really hard for me to see where you guys found the trees, because it just seems so complex at times. But the beauty of this album is that it also felt like you guys tried to simplify some of the process, at least giving the perception of simplicity to allow folks like me to better understand it and to better grasp it and to better connect with it. Because sometimes an album is so complicated that it becomes overbearing for the listener. And this album doesn't feel like 52 minutes. It feels like 5 minutes, because it's super enjoyable to listen to. So it has that playability factor. Is that ever in the back of your mind, or is that just a nice end result of all the work you guys put into making the record?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, I'm always thinking about the track list and the flow of the record from about halfway through the writing process, I guess. Like, once we had 3 or 4 songs in the works, I'm already thinking, like, pretty early. Pretty early, I thought Equus was the opening track and the Graal was the closing track. We added Enhardonia at the end as kind of a bit of a after, I'm not sure the right word to use, a bit of a wind down to kind of let people process everything they've just experienced leading up to that point. But through that whole process, it's keeping all of those different things in mind. It's trying to keep in mind the ebb and flow. It's trying to keep in mind also what we've done in the past. So how have we started songs? How have we ended songs? How have we transitioned between songs? And try not to, because it's album number 4. And so, I mean, it's kind of going, okay, well, we've finished a bunch of songs on the last couple of albums with this sort of ending. So let's, like, try and avoid that if we can. Let's challenge ourselves to come up with a different way to end this song. Another thing, like Misericord 1, the original, version of that, I'm sure had an intro. And we have a lot of intros. I think of, like, on Earn, I think of, like, Libera Part 1, Saturnine Spheres, has a, a little 30-second kind of clean guitar, thing, and then it goes boom into the main heavy riff. We've done that a bunch of times. Whereas, so for this one, it was like, no, what if we get rid of that and just go boom, he's the start of the song. And then especially the idea, when we're putting it all together, of with Equus having the cutoff ending and then going straight into the song that goes bam right into the first riff. This was something, okay, I don't think we've done that before in the way that we've flowed a record. And when you do something that maybe is not expected compared to what you've done in the past, it makes it a bit easier to grab the listener. And then I guess that you were talking about that simplicity. The other thing that I think is really important with that is the ability to communicate the music to the listener is so much dependent on not just the songwriting, and that is important, but it's also the performances have to be great. The recording has to be great. So the quality of the engineers you're working with has to be really great to capture the performance. But then the mixing and mastering is so important. And the mixing and the mastering on this record is quite different to all our other albums. And I think it's a lot better, to be honest. And the reason for that is because we worked with Mark Lewis, not just as a mixing mastering engineer, which we did on Earn, but he was also the producer. So when we're making decisions on the guitars, the drums, the drum sounds, the bass tones, he couldn't come to Australia, unfortunately, but, we're in the studio recording the same vocal line on 5 mics and sending it to him saying, hey, which vocal mic do you think will work better for the sounds that we've already chosen for the guitars and the drums to make sure everything fits together? And we've never worked with the one person from start to finish. And even though it was a lot more complicated because of the pandemic, just having that relationship to go through ended up meaning that the mix was a lot more cohesive. And when the mix is really cohesive, it just makes it easier for the listener to get it, because they're not having to use their imagination to feel the energy. It's just there. And if you just listen to it a few times, it comes through. And so just really like hats off to Mark Lewis for the amazing job he did in helping us bring our vision to life on this record. Because I do think that plays a big role in it feeling easier or more accessible. Because I'm not sure, I don't know if the writing is that different. Sometimes it's harder to tell when you're in the band. But I do know that the mixing is a bit easier to understand, I think.
I have one last question for you because we're running out of time, but you guys are coming to North America. You're going to be playing in Toronto in September. So we're going to have to continue this conversation when you guys come to Toronto, because I have so much more to ask you about this record. But I want to ask you the last question about the vocals. I felt like this was perhaps the most balanced record vocally when it comes to you and Hen, the way you guys work the vocals together. Do you see it that way? Is this a more mature record vocally, not just from performance-wise, but also how you guys incorporated each other's techniques and each other's ranges into songs?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I really think that for me, I think it's kind of by far my best album vocally, like for my vocals. When we started, I was a violinist that sang a bit. And it was probably Earn was the first album where I really felt confident in how the result came out and felt a bit more like a singer. And now obviously we're fast forwarding another 5 years, and I feel just a lot more confident in being able to challenge myself to do different things vocally, and just being confident that I'm good at it. Because I've done like 30 years of more than 30 years. I've been playing the violin for 34 years. So it's easy to feel like I know what I'm doing, whereas I've kind of grown as a singer through the band's career. And for Zen and I think it's just that learning experience. Him and I, we've been in this band almost 20 years together. And him and I have been there right since the beginning, and we work together really well, and we work together very closely when we're writing. None of us make decisions on anything without talking to the other when it comes to our part. So the violins, the clean vocals and the heavy vocals are all written in coordination between Zen and I. We get some riffs and stuff like that, and then I say, hey, I've got some cool ideas here. What are you thinking? We have a chat. We might negotiate a little bit about if we've got ideas for the same part, or send me what you've got. We'll see what works better. But we work very closely. So that's really just a testament to it's album number 4. We're learning about how to make that work. And also, I think we're a bit more aware of what we're good at. As musicians, you can't be great at everything, but you do have strengths. And so I think we're a bit more aware of, hey, this is what I'm good at, and this is what you're good at. And let's, try to highlight those strengths that each of us has in the band. And I think we're just slowly getting better with that with each record.
So I guess the next record is still going to be the best record, and so forth and so forth with that growing process. Tim,
hopefully.
I mean, that's the goal that everybody has. It's always the next record is the best record. Tim, thank you very much for your time today. Obliviscaris' new album coming out, Exul, March 24th on Season of Mist, and you guys have a huge North American tour kicking off in the fall. with Beyond Creation and Persephone. I'm looking forward to that show in Toronto. So I'll definitely make efforts to continue this conversation then, because there's still more to find out from you guys about this album. Is like an onion. You keep peeling layers and you keep discovering new stuff. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Take care, man.